Howdy, this is Lemmy with RevZilla TV, here to talk to you today about how to install an air filter and an air cleaner on your Harley. Alrighty, if you're thinking about modifying your air filtration system on your Harley, odds are probably pretty good that you've got performance on your mind. There's really two ways you can go. There's a fork in the road, and you can choose whichever is going to be more apt for your situation. You can elect to replace just the air filter element itself. That lives inside of your factory housing. You retain your factory housing and get a high flow filter inside of there. What it's going to allow you to do is spend less time wrenching, spend a little less money, and retain your factory look. The other option you have is to replace the entire air cleaner assembly. That's going to give you all of the same benefits that the high flow filter give you, but it's also going to require a little bit more wrenching, a few more tools, and it's going to let you sort of control how the right side of your bike looks. It's going to let you change up the style on that right side of your bike. The other thing you should know too is due to the design, a lot of aftermarket air cleaners are going to be better able to support really high horsepower builds. So if you're the sort of person who's out there really trying to make a bunch of big power, an air cleaner assembly is probably the way to go. Now with respect to installation on these, it's not very difficult no matter which route you take. I'm going to say it's between 1 and 2 beards on our BSD, our beard scale of difficulty. For those of you folks who are installing just the filter element alone, I'm going to say that's a pretty solid 1 beard. It's a good project suitable for a beginner. You're not going to need a whole bunch of tools, and you're not going to spend a whole bunch of time on it. I'd budget maybe 15 to 30 minutes on the project itself. Now, if you're looking at a whole air cleaner assembly, things get a little bit more difficult. I'm going to call it either a hard 1 beard or an easy 2 bearder, depending really on what kind of bike it is that you're working on and what kind of air cleaner you're actually installing. Things are going to differ just a little bit. There's 2 things I want you to think about before you start ripping your bike apart. The first is this. We're showing you how to actually put on some sort of an air filtration modification, either a filter or a cleaner. Now, when you're doing that, we're showing you how to bolt that up to the motorcycle. You do want to keep in mind, though, that in order to take full advantage of that newfound air that your Harley is able to huff down now, you're probably also going to need to add something in the way of fuel, especially if you have other power adders on your bike, like an exhaust. As soon as you start stacking power adders on top of each other, it allows air and exhaust to move through the motor much more quickly. To compensate for that and allow you to take full advantage of the performance benefits of all of the parts you've installed, you're going to want to also bump up the fuel system. For you carbureted guys, that's going to mean a rejet, and for those of you who are on fuel-injected bikes, it either means the addition or remapping of a fuel controller. The other thing I want you to think about too is that we're using our 2013 Street Glide here. This is our test mule for this particular project. Now you might be working on something similar or totally different. We're also going to install a very specific air cleaner. Again, you might have something similar or different. It is important, therefore, to read the directions that come with your factory air cleaner or filter, and it's also important too to have a copy of the factory service manual handy for your appropriate year, make, or model. That's something that's going to make sure that if you see something that's a little different on your bike than the one we're working on, you're going to be able to work through that. This bike should serve as a good general guideline for most of you guys riding around on a late model Harley. All right, let's get to work. First thing I need to do in order to begin this process, regardless of whether I'm installing an air filter or an air cleaner, is to get at things. So what I'm going to do here is get this outer cover off by using the appropriately sized Allen bit to spin this baby off of here. Once I back this thing out, you'll notice the cover sort of comes free, and I can get that out of the way. When I do that, I'm going to set it off to the side and retain it, and now you can see we actually have access to the air filter itself. From here, what I'm going to do is use a T27 Torx bit to start backing out these bolts. Now these bolts sort of serve 2 functions. They help sandwich the air filter to the throttle body itself, and they also retain the air filter cover bracket. This is actually what the air filter cover physically bolts down to. That chrome football bolts right to this bracket. Once we get these bolts free out of here, we'll have access to the air filter assembly itself. And you'll see this thing sort of start falling apart as I'm working on it. That's a good thing. It means we're making good progress. So we'll back this final bolt out of here, and that's all that physically retains this thing to the motorcycle. Now we're ready to actually remove this baby. When you remove your filter, one of the things you want to consider are the breather hoses back here. These things are made of a soft and pliable rubber. You need to actually get this out of here, but we don't want to mar up those breather hoses. You might need to reuse them. So when you remove the filter, hook your fingers back behind them and gently work them off there. Now we've got this thing free of the motorcycle. This thing's actually set to fly. So at this stage of the game, we're actually going to fork the video. Regardless of whether you're installing an air filter or an air cleaner, removal up till this point has been exactly the same. If you're reinstalling just an air filter element, hang tight 1 second. We're going to start that reinstallation process in just a moment. For those of you who are considering popping an air cleaner onto your bike though, click below and you can skip ahead a little bit. That's going to get you past some of this stuff, and I'll show you how to keep taking off this factory housing. Air filter guys, let's continue. So one of the things we need to consider with the factory air filter on here is the moving over of parts, like those breather tubes I talked about. So what I'm going to do is actually just pop these things out. They come out really easily. Now it's important when you're looking at these breather tubes, give them a really careful, close inspection. There's hot, oily mist coming through these. It actually helps your engine breathe. So what that oil can sometimes do, especially coupled with that high temperature, is sort of crack these or split them. So you want to inspect them really carefully. Ours look like they're in pretty good shape, so I'm going to go ahead and reuse them. They just plug right into the back of the air filter in most cases. It's pretty simple. One of the other things I want to show you on here too is this gasket. You can see on our factory filter, this gasket is really ripped and torn in some spots. Now there's not really much sense in trying to put a new air filtration system on your bike if you have a crummy gasket on there, because that's just going to let all sorts of dirty, gross air in anyway. Nobody wants an air leak. So make sure if your new air filter doesn't come with a gasket that you do actually install one. You can see here that I do have an air filter, or rather, I'm sorry, a new gasket on this air filter, and this thing is set to rock and roll now. So what I'm going to do is install this. Putting it back in is very similar to the actual removal process itself. I'm going to hook up these breather tubes. They just push right over these ball ends on the breather bolts and rock this thing into place. So you can see now this is in approximately the right place. Now I already had a gasket installed in there. I used just a touch of RTV silicone to locate the gasket. If you elect not to do that, that's fine. Sometimes a mechanic's pick can come in handy here. What you can do is actually use the mechanic's pick to help line up the bolt holes. The reason this is important is because when you're reinstalling the cover bracket on here, it's going to keep those threads from tearing up the actual gasket itself. I can't tell you how many times I've seen somebody install a fresh gasket but then tear it up with the threads on the fastener they're using to locate the bracket in place. So I'm going to work these things in by hand first. It's really important to stick your fasteners in here by hand without using a tool because it'll keep you from damaging anything. Once you feel the fastener catch the threads, then you can feel free to run these things down. Get them snugged up is what I like to do, and then after that, kind of move my way around there, and after that I'll find the factory torque on these things to actually crank them down. Now I'm doing this one kind of by feel. However, I would recommend, especially if you're not very experienced doing this, use a torque wrench. There are factory torque specs listed in your manual, and they're going to be specific for each year, make, and model. Make sure that you're keeping them in mind and using them. Again, do as I say, not as I do. So we've got this puppy back in and ready to rock and roll. This thing's set to go. Now, we're installing a reusable air filter like this. They're usually ready to rock right out of the box. Now, you may have to wash or re-oil this from time to time. Again, we talked about this being a permanent air filter, and that's the truth. This thing's in there for life, but it does require an occasional bit of maintenance. So you're going to be doing this process also when you go to maintain your air filter, not just install a fresh one. So keep that in mind. All we have left to do is to install this cover. Now before we pop this thing in here, I do want to show you this gasket in here. This gasket's actually a pretty important piece. Believe it or not, before we started filming, I checked out our factory one, and it was pretty knackered. It didn't look that good. It doesn't seem like it's a super important piece, but what this gasket does is keeps this outer cover from rattling against the housing. It can be really irritating when you're running down the road, hearing this thing rattling and making all sorts of racket. What it does when it rattles too is also helps loosen up the bolt. That's not a good situation. So examine your gasket, make sure it's nice, soft, pliable rubber. If it's cracked or torn, you probably want to think about running down to your local toy store and replacing it. Once you've ascertained it's in pretty good shape, gently guide it into place, take your bolt and just pitch that thing in there by hand. And then again, without using a tool, get that Allen bolt back down and snug. Once you've got it in place, make sure the cover is sitting nicely against the inner housing, and you can again rock that thing down to actually factory spec. Again, use your torque wrench if you're not entirely certain about your ability to use a safe amount of torque on this. From here, we're pretty much set to fly. I'm going to wipe this thing off so it looks nice. Make sure that outer cover looks nice and shiny and that chrome is gleaming. And I'm pretty much done. I think most of you will agree this is a pretty simple, pretty rewarding project. You're going to get effectively a lifetime air filter if you've bought one from RevZilla, and this thing is going to make your bike actually huff down a little bit better. It's going to get some air into it. It's going to help your performance. It's going to be a good piece of an overall performance package. Now at this stage of the game, I need to start taking some stuff apart here so I can show the air cleaner guys how to install their stuff. Man, I'm getting really thirsty from all this work. Time for a drink! Man, that's pretty good. What'd you say it's called? A Marianne and Ginger? Oh, a Jack and Ginger. That does not sound nearly as fun. Alrighty, those of you fellas who are installing an air cleaner, you got a little more work ahead of you, but you spent a little bit more money. However, the upshot is that you're going to get a little bit more control over how your motorcycle looks. What do we have to do to get to where the air filter guys are not? We're going to get the back side of this air cleaner off here. The backing plate needs to come off. We're going to spin out these banjo bolts. These banjo bolts are kind of interesting pieces here. They actually serve two different functions. The first function you can see is that these things actually do hold the backing plate to the engine itself. But one of the other things that's cool about these, if you look, is that they're hollow. These things actually pass the hot oil and air mist into your air filter. It helps keep Mother Nature and your motorcycle a little bit cleaner. You got to undo these puppies, and then your backing plate can come right off. I would say set this stuff aside in case you ever want to go back to your factory ham can or football as the case may be, or if you just want to bring them to the swap meet, you'll be able to sell them easily to somebody. So now what we need to do is start reassembling our air cleaner. Now depending on what it is that you're using, you may have a little different process than we're dealing with, but typically it looks something like this. You're going to work with some sort of a breather setup to replace the factory one that we just removed. Moving on from there, you may dress some things up with some chrome caps. Then we're going to use an adapter plate on the throttle body. What the adapter plate allows us to do is go from Harley's bolt pattern in the throttle body to S&S's more standard one that they use on just about all of their backing plates. From there we can attach the backing plate to the adapter plate, then it's on with the filter, on with the cover, and we're moving down the road. Let's get started with things. I'm going to install our breather assembly. I've already got this thing sort of assembled together. What we're going to do is gently guide this into the heads and install this thing, because this is going to replace the factory setup that I just removed. Now you might notice that I'm using my hands to install this. That's really, really important. Despite the fact that you can see that these are some huge hex heads on these bolts, they're steel. The breather bolts are steel on this setup. If you wind up using a steel bolt and catching a thread wrong in the aluminum heads, you can do a lot of severe damage. Your fingers aren't strong enough to do that damage, so use your fingers when you're actually installing these. Get them all lined up, and then from there you can apply a wrench to these. Now keep in mind, this is so important because getting to those things, if you do actually damage your heads, not easy or fun. You're effectively looking at an entire top-end rebuild. You will regret it if you wind up using a tool and you mar something on your heads. So just be safe and wait until you've got them threaded in by hand like we're doing. As you can see, it doesn't really take all that long. We're going to snug down this other side here, taking care to keep that tube nice and safe. And we're set to go. Now we're going to install these chrome caps here. S&S includes these really nice chrome caps. You can see here these bolts have a natural finish on them. They're not terribly ugly, but hey, a little bit of chrome makes every bike look a little bit nicer. And really, making the bike look nice is a big part of what using a whole air cleaner assembly is all about. You'll notice, once again, I'm installing these things by hand. The reason here is that I don't want to use a ratchet on here. It'll give me too much leverage. And again, you could possibly risk damaging either the threaded fastener or the threaded inlet they're going into. From here, I'm going to snug these things down. Now there is a torque spec on these. I am unfortunately willfully ignoring it. I've done a couple of these and I feel pretty confident that I'm not going to damage anything. However, if this is your first time doing this, you probably want to make sure that you're following the instructions correctly. So the breather hose setup is set to rock and roll, and from here I'm going to install the adapter plate. What it basically does is changes this bolt pattern here into the different bolt pattern that S&S uses for their backing plate. It's not very difficult at all. So we're going to line this thing up, and one of the important parts here is replacing the gasket. The gasket helps seal in, again, that nice clean air and keeps dirt from getting into your engine. So making sure you're treating the gaskets nicely is very important. One of the things I like to do when I'm doing these is take a bolt, get it onto your fastener, line up your gasket and one of your bolt holes on your adapter plate, sneak it down there, and just get one bolt loosely installed. You can kind of let things swing. You can see this is just sort of all floating around. But this is going to make the installation easier, believe it or not. Here's why. We have to line the gasket up with the throttle body, as well as the adapter plate itself. As I swing each of these pieces in, I can again use my mechanics pick to line these things up. It makes it really easy. Whenever you're sandwiching parts in like this, life can get just a little bit difficult. So by using my mechanics pick to make this job a little bit simpler, I can run into the fasteners, again, just by hand, taking it easy on things. Boy, I'm starting to sound like a broken record, aren't I? Get that third fastener in. We're going to spin that puppy down, again, also by hand. And at this stage of the game, I'm ready to actually lock this thing down with a little bit of torque. Again, if you're not familiar and you don't have a good hand feel for what an appropriate torque spec might be on this thing, feel free to use your factory manual specifications and double check what your aftermarket air cleaner has to say about it too. They may differ from the factory specs. However, factory specs are always a good bet on something like this. Again, break out your torque wrench, get right to it. From here, we're going to install the backing plate, and this process is almost exactly the same. One of the things I want to show you in the backing plate though is this little pipe. This pipe actually hooks up to the breather hose that we just installed. This is how all those hot oils and air gas mixture get through the backing plate and into the filter itself. So I'm going to install that on the hose. And then from here, it sort of works itself into place almost. If you'll notice, we're about lined up on there. But I still need a gasket in there. That's also very important. So what I'm going to do is sort of the exact same thing I just did. I'm getting the weirdest feeling of deja vu here. I'm going to work that puppy up in here and get that gasket sitting approximately where I expect it to sit. And then I'm going to use my pick, again, to sort of tease it into place to get it exactly where I want it. And you'll notice here, as I work this pick in here, this gasket sort of lines right up. It goes exactly where it belongs. And that's good. The reason that's important is because if you have the gasket overhanging, the threads on the fasteners can actually tear up the gasket. That's especially bad too with the new gasket. You just paid all that money for a gasket that works out really nicely. However, if you put a big old rip in it, the gasket's not able to do its job despite the fact that it is a brand new part. So taking a little care here really can help ease the installation pain. Now you'll notice, looks like we have a good straight shot at it here for our fasteners. I'm going to work those in gently with my fingers. Again, taking care not to ruin the threads in the adapter plate. The adapter plate's aluminum, similar to our scenario with the throttle body, and these fasteners are steel. It's very easy to tear something up unexpectedly. Again, taking a little extra time here, a few extra seconds here is going to save us a lot of heartache down the road. So I'm going to snug these down again using a torque wrench if possible. If you feel real confident that you're not going to destroy anything, you can always elect to skip that. Again, do the right thing. So once we got these things all cranked down here, we're really coming into the home stretch. At this point, we're going to throw the filter on here. So I'm going to take the filter and just sort of hang it in place. That's about where the filter is going to sit. One of the things I want you to take note of is actually the filter itself. You look at the walls on this, they're actually made of rubber. That rubber is intentional. This filter actually compresses just a little bit. So it actually acts as a gasket. That's what that rubber seal on here is doing. So what you'll notice is as I take our cover and work it gently into place here, you can see the bolt holes poking through yet again. By hand, yet again, I'm just going to work in some fasteners here to make life easy. Now these are going to tighten up a little differently than the other fasteners. The other fasteners, you're going to feel them spin and spin and spin, and then they start to bottom, as a fastener going into metal usually does. Because these are actually compressing that rubber just a little bit, they tend to sort of just tighten up. They get snugger and snugger over time. So what I like to do when I'm installing an air filter cover like this, I like to kind of snug these things down just a little bit, but I do it progressively. I kind of go around in a circle a couple times to make sure that everything's getting snugged down evenly. You want a nice even torque on these things. So as I approach what is going to be the final torque value on these, I'm about set to rock and roll. You'll notice these things aren't moving much farther. With liberal application of a screwdriver here, I'm pretty much good to go. So what I'm going to do at this point, wipe this puppy off. Boy, it really does look fantastic. With, as you saw, a pretty minimal time effort, not too much money, we're getting effectively a lifetime performance enhancement for the motorcycle. Not to mention, you're never going to be buying another air filter again. It's kind of a pretty important benefit if you ask me. Now, if you're still not sure if this is right for you, check out my Common Tread article on this. I tried to delve a little bit deeper into some of the options here you have with respect to either an air filter or an air cleaner assembly. And for a lot of you, neither may be appropriate. You might just want to stick with your stock setup. That is also a very viable option. Now, if you need a little bit of help, you can either leave me a comment down below or get in touch with one of our gear geeks. You can get them at 877-792-9455 if you're a phone talker, or if you're one of those folks who likes to write out an email, cs@RevZilla.com will get you a Gear Geek live. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Lemmy. I'm out of here.